Astor, Roosevelt, Forbes, Yale University, Harvard. These names mean something to you. What they don't tell you is every single one of them built their wealth the same exact way. They pumped China full of opium, thousands upon thousands of tons, millions of people destroyed by addiction, profit margins hitting 400, sometimes 500%, and then they spent the next 2 centuries burying the story so deep you'd never stumble across it. Until right now. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president, the face carved into Mount Rushmore next to Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. The man who guided America through the Great Depression and World War II. A genuine American hero by every measure we're taught. But here's the part they leave out of your history class. The fortune that bankrolled FDR's entire privileged childhood, paid for his Harvard education, launched his political career, all of it traces back to drug trafficking. His grandfather, Warren Delano II, became a multimillionaire moving opium into China. Millions of Chinese citizens fell into addiction. Millions more died. And the Delano family walked away filthy rich, extremely rich. They had company. The Astors, who at one point were the wealthiest family in the entire United States. Opium profits. The Forbes family. Yes, that Forbes, the magazine empire. Built on opium money. The Perkins family bankrolled Yale University with opium cash. The Cabot family, those Boston Brahmins everyone respects. Opium traders. The Russell family started Skull and Bones at Yale. Opium smugglers financed it. Some of the most powerful, most celebrated, most influential bloodlines in American history constructed their empires by selling drugs. Not just dipping their toes in, they dominated the trade. By the 1830s, American companies were moving 10% of all opium flowing into China. We're discussing tons of the stuff. Hundreds of chests. Hundreds of millions in revenue. An entire generation of Chinese people annihilated by addiction, while American families accumulated so much wealth they could establish universities, erect museums, and build political dynasties that continue running this country today. This is the story nobody once told. How America's aristocratic families made their original fortunes in the opium trade. How they systematically whitewashed that entire chapter of history. And how these same families that got obscenely rich peddling drugs then turned around and spent 100 years criminalizing drugs for everybody else. The level of hypocrisy defies belief, and the evidence backing it up is ironclad. Before we walk through each family, you need to understand what the opium trade actually looked like. Not the cleaned up museum exhibit version, the real operation. Early 1800s, Britain faced a serious problem. They were purchasing enormous quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain from China, but China wanted absolutely nothing Britain manufactured. So Britain kept bleeding silver, paying out their reserves. They desperately needed something to sell back to China, something Chinese consumers would buy in massive volume. They found their answer. Opium. Grown in British-controlled India, processed into smokable form, and smuggled into China, where it was explicitly illegal. The Chinese government had already banned opium. They understood it was poison, destroying their people. But British traders didn't care, and American traders sure as hell didn't care either. The profit margins were 400 to 500%. You could purchase opium in India for $100, smuggle it into China, flip it for $500 or $600. The risk was substantial. Chinese authorities would execute smugglers on the spot if they caught you. But those profits made the risk worth taking every single time. American families wanted their peace because American ships were faster than anything the British had. Clipper ships engineered purely for speed, perfect for outrunning Chinese naval patrols and delivering opium to hidden coastal drop points. American captains would sail down to British India, load up thousands of pounds of opium, sail to the Chinese coast, and anchor offshore at predetermined coordinates. Chinese smugglers would row out in small boats, collect the opium, pay in silver. The American ships technically never entered Chinese ports. Plausible deniability if anyone asked questions. The silver poured back into America. Tons of it. This pattern continued for decades. From the 1800s through the 1840s, before the Opium Wars erupted, then kept right on going afterward. Millions of Chinese citizens became addicted. The Chinese economy got devastated. Silver drained out of China, straight into British and American bank accounts. And in America, the families getting rich off this blood trade used that money to construct legitimate business empires. Let's examine exactly who these people were. Start with the most famous name, the Delanos, FDR's family. Warren Delano II was born in 1809 in Massachusetts. At 19 years old, he sailed to China to work for a trading company. By 24, he'd become a partner in Russell and Company, the largest American opium trading operation in China. Russell and Company wasn't just participating in the opium business. They dominated American involvement completely. They maintained offices in Canton, which is Guangzhou today. They owned clipper ships. They had established connections with British opium cultivators in India, and they made millions upon millions. Warren Delano ran the entire operation from 1833 to 1846, 13 solid years of opium smuggling. When he finally returned to America, he came back an extraordinarily wealthy man. How wealthy are we talking? Rich enough to construct a 40-room mansion in Newburgh, New York. Rich enough to send all his children to the finest schools available. Rich enough that when he lost a chunk of money in the Panic of 1857, he could simply sail back to China, make another fortune smuggling opium, and return even wealthier than before. His daughter Sarah Delano married James Roosevelt. Their son became Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR grew up surrounded by wealth, private tutors, Harvard education, political connections that opened every door, all of it funded by opium money flowing from China. And here's the absolute kicker. In 1935, while FDR sat in the White House as president, he signed the first federal laws creating strict controls on drugs. The Marijuana Tax Act precursor. Major expansion of narcotic regulations. The man whose entire family fortune came from selling drugs to Chinese people spent his presidency criminalizing drugs for American citizens. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. Now, let's examine the Astors. John Jacob Astor. At one point, the single wealthiest man in America. His fortune built the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, funded public libraries, created a dynasty that's still recognized today. Where did all that money actually come from? The official story says furs, right? He traded furs. That's partially true, but that's not where the real money originated. Opium. John Jacob Astor's ships started sailing to China in 1800. His vessel, the Macedonian, made regular opium runs. Astor wasn't just trading furs for Chinese goods. He was trading Turkish opium for Chinese silver, then using that silver to purchase furs, tea, and silk. The opium leg of the trade was what made everything else profitable. By 1840, Astor was worth $20 million. That translates to roughly $500 million in today's currency. The majority of it came from opium profits. His great-grandson, John Jacob Astor IV, died on the Titanic as one of the richest men on Earth. That entire fortune built on opium. The Astor family name appears on libraries, museums, and university buildings across America. Every bit of it funded by drug money extracted from China. The Forbes family. Yes, exactly that Forbes. Malcolm Forbes, the magazine publisher and billionaire. His family fortune started in China. The Forbes family out of Boston sent ships to China throughout the early 1800s. Robert Bennett Forbes and his brother, John Murray Forbes, were major opium traders. They worked directly with Russell and Company, the same operation Warren Delano ran. Robert Forbes captained clipper ships that transported opium. John Forbes invested the profits into railroads and became one of Boston's wealthiest men. Their descendants used that accumulated wealth to launch Forbes magazine. The family transformed into American aristocracy, and it all started with opium. John Murray Forbes gets celebrated in Boston as a great businessman and philanthropist. There are statues of him. Buildings carry his name. Nobody mentions the opium. It's been systematically scrubbed from the official history books. The Perkins family. Thomas Handicid Perkins, known around Boston as T.H. Perkins, one of the wealthiest men in all of New England during the 1800s. Funded hospitals, asylums, schools. How did he accumulate his fortune? Opium. Perkins was a founding partner of Perkins and Company, which eventually merged with Russell and Company. He ran opium from both Turkey and India into China for decades, made millions, then retired to Boston and became a respected philanthropist that everyone admired. Yale University's Perkins Fellowship, named after his family, funded by opium money. The Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, opium money. Thomas Perkins is remembered as a great man. The opium part barely gets mentioned, if it's mentioned at all. The Russell family. Samuel Russell founded Russell and Company back in 1823. It grew into the dominant American opium trading firm operating in China. Russell made an absolutely enormous fortune, retired to Connecticut, and in 1832, his cousin William Huntington Russell co-founded Skull and Bones at Yale University. Skull and Bones, the secret society that's produced presidents, Supreme Court justices, CIA directors. George H.W. Bush. George W. Bush, John Kerry, all Bonesmen. The Russell family fortune that helped establish Yale's most powerful secret society came directly from opium. Samuel Russell's money also helped fund the Russell Trust, which continues funding Skull and Bones operations to this very day. The most powerful secret society in America was built on Chinese opium money. The Cabot family, Boston Brahmins, old money, respected everywhere. Their wealth came from trading with China during the early 1800s. Guess what they traded? Opium. The Cabot family name is plastered everywhere in Boston. Cabot House at Harvard. Streets named Cabot. But the opium connection never gets mentioned in polite company. The Lowe family. Abiel Abbott Lowe, another prominent opium trader. He ran clipper ships to China and made millions doing it. His son Seth Lowe became president of Columbia University and later mayor of New York City. The family donated money to construct Lowe Memorial Library at Columbia. Opium money built an Ivy League library that students walk past every single day. Here's the pattern you need to see clearly. American families sail to China in the early 1800s. They work for opium trading firms or they start their own operations. They make enormous fortunes smuggling opium. They return to America. They invest in railroads, real estate, legitimate businesses. They become respectable. They fund universities, museums, libraries, hospitals. They systematically erase the opium connection from their family histories. Their descendants become American aristocracy, and nobody talks about where the original money came from. This wasn't some small-scale operation. By the 1830s, American firms controlled approximately 10% of all opium flowing into China. British firms controlled most of the rest, but Americans were significant players. Russell and Company alone shipped thousands of chests of opium every single year. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds. Thousands of pounds of opium. Year after year after year. The scale was industrial, and the profits were absolutely massive. A single successful opium voyage could return 400 to 500% profit. Ship captains and company owners became millionaires. In 1830s, money. That's multi-millionaire or billionaire level in today's terms. And this continued for decades. Even after the Opium Wars, which China fought specifically to stop the opium trade from destroying their country, American firms kept smuggling. They just got better at hiding it. Let's discuss what this opium actually did to China. By the 1830s, an estimated 10 to 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium. That's approximately 10% of the entire adult male population. The addiction was so widespread, it crippled the Chinese economy. Silver that should have stayed in China was flowing out to pay for more opium. The Chinese government tried desperately to stop it. They appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu to end the trade once and for all. In 1839, Commissioner Lin confiscated and destroyed over 1,000 tons of British opium in Canton. 1,000 tons. Britain's response? War. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. Britain won decisively, forced China to sign the Treaty of Nanking. China had to pay reparations to Britain, pay reparations to the people who'd been poisoning their citizens. They had to open ports to British trade and cede Hong Kong. The treaty didn't explicitly legalize opium, but it made enforcement completely impossible. So the opium trade expanded dramatically. American firms benefited enormously from this war, because while British firms couldn't operate during active combat, American firms like Russell and Company swooped in and took over their entire business. After the war ended, both British and American opium smuggling resumed at even higher levels than before. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, happened for the exact same reason. China tried to stop the trade. Britain and France went to war against China, forced China to legalize opium outright, and open even more ports. American firms profited again during and after the conflict. The human cost in China was absolutely catastrophic. Millions addicted, families completely destroyed, the economy wrecked beyond recognition. But back in Boston, New York, and Connecticut, American families were constructing mansions and founding universities with the profits. Here's the most infuriating part of this entire story. The same families that made fortunes selling opium then turned around and criminalized drugs for everyone else. In the early 1900s, America led the international movement to ban opium. The Hague Opium Convention of 1912, the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. America pushed global drug prohibition harder than anyone. Why? Because by that point, American elites had already extracted their wealth. Chinese immigration to America meant opium dens were opening up in American cities. The elites didn't want competition. They didn't want American workers getting addicted the way Chinese workers had been. And they certainly didn't want anyone pointing out that their own family fortunes came from the drug trade they were now criminalizing. So they banned it, painted opium users as criminals and degenerates, buried the history of how their own families had mass-marketed that exact same drug to China for pure profit. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose grandfather made millions in the opium business, signed some of the toughest drug laws in American history. The families that got rich from drugs spent the entire 20th century prosecuting and imprisoning people for drugs. The hypocrisy is absolutely breathtaking, and here's what makes this even worse. The history has been systematically whitewashed. Most Americans have zero idea that the Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, and Cabot families made their fortunes in opium. Go visit the FDR Presidential Library. The Delano family's opium connection gets mentioned in one tiny exhibit, downplayed as simple trade with China. Nothing about the drugs, nothing about the millions destroyed. Go read the Astor family history. Opium barely gets mentioned. It's all about furs and real estate development. The Forbes family history talks endlessly about railroads and magazines. Not a word about opium. Yale University mentions Samuel Russell as a benefactor. The opium business that funded him? Not mentioned. Harvard's Cabot House, named after the Cabot family. Their opium trading doesn't appear in the official history. The whitewashing has been systematic and thorough. These families used their wealth and influence to rewrite history completely. They donated to universities with the understanding that certain facts would be omitted. They controlled historical narratives through foundations and endowments. And they made absolutely certain their descendants grew up never knowing the truth about where the money actually came from. But the evidence is undeniable. Shipping records exist. Letters survive. Account books sit in historical archives in China, Britain, and America. Researchers have documented everything. Books have been written. The Delano Influence by Daniel W. Delano. When America First Met China by Eric J. Dolan. The Opium Clippers by Basil Lubbock. Yankee Traders, Old Coasters, and African Middlemen by George E. Brooks, Jr. The proof exists in multiple forms, but it's not taught in schools. It's not displayed in the museums. The average American has absolutely no idea. And the families want to keep it exactly that way. Because if people knew the real truth, it would destroy their carefully crafted reputations completely. It would raise uncomfortable questions nobody wants asked. If the Delano family got rich selling drugs that destroyed millions of Chinese lives, how exactly is FDR a hero? If the Forbes family made their fortune poisoning China, why do we celebrate Malcolm Forbes as some kind of business icon? If Yale's skull and bones was funded by opium money, what does that tell us about American elite institutions? The cognitive dissonance would be too much for most people to handle. So the truth stays buried. Here's the comparison they absolutely don't want you making. In the 1980s and 1990s, the CIA was implicated in allowing cocaine to flow into American inner cities to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua. The crack epidemic destroyed black communities across America. When that story finally broke, there was outrage, congressional investigations, public admissions. Gary Webb, the journalist who exposed the connection, was destroyed professionally. But the story got out there. People understood that the government had allowed drugs to devastate communities for political and financial gain. Now, apply that exact same logic to the 1800s. American families deliberately flooded China with opium purely for profit. Millions of Chinese lives destroyed. The Chinese economy crippled. And those families used the profits to build American institutions that still exist today. Where's the outrage? Where's the reckoning? Where's the accountability? There isn't any. Because the families that committed these crimes became so wealthy and so powerful, they could rewrite history. They could make certain their crimes were forgotten, and they could ensure their descendants lived in luxury, never having to confront what their ancestors actually did to accumulate that wealth. Let's be absolutely clear about the scale we're discussing. Conservative estimates suggest that American firms made $50 to $100 million from the China opium trade between 1800 and 1860. That's 50 to 100 million in 1800s currency. Adjusted for inflation, that translates to $1.5 to $3 billion in today's money, and that's just the profits. The total value of the opium moved was many times higher than that. This wasn't small-time smuggling. This was industrial-scale drug trafficking. Ships, warehouses, agents, bribes, a complete logistical operation. The American firms involved employed thousands of people, Chinese middlemen, ship crews, Canton-based factors, Boston-based investors. It was a massive organized criminal enterprise. Except it wasn't considered criminal in America. It was just business. And the men who ran it were celebrated as successful merchants and captains of industry. Here's the modern equivalent, so you can understand the scale properly. Imagine if a group of American billionaires today were caught running a cartel that flooded Mexico with fentanyl. Millions of Mexicans addicted, hundreds of thousands dead, And these billionaires used the profits to endow Harvard, fund political campaigns, and build museums. Then, 150 years later, their descendants are presidents, senators, and university chancellors, and nobody talks about where the original money came from. That's exactly what happened with the opium families. Except we're the descendants living in the world they built with blood money, and we're not supposed to ask questions about any of it. The Chinese remember. In China, the opium wars are a core part of national identity. They call it the Century of Humiliation, the period when Western powers forced opium on China and carved up the country like a piece of meat. It's taught in every single school. Every Chinese person knows that Britain and America poisoned their country for profit, and they know it led directly to colonization, wars, and millions of deaths. But in America, we don't teach this history. Most Americans couldn't tell you what the opium wars were even about. They certainly don't know that American families got rich from it. And they definitely don't know that those families still control enormous wealth and power today. The contrast is staggering. China remembers and teaches what was done to them. America forgets and whitewashes what we did. And the families that profited are perfectly happy to keep it that way. So what do we do with this information? First, we tell the truth. The Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell, Cabot, and Low families made their fortunes selling opium to China. Millions of Chinese were addicted and died. The Chinese economy was devastated. And American families got rich enough to found dynasties that still exist. Second, we acknowledge the hypocrisy. The same families that made fortunes from drugs then criminalized drugs for everyone else. They used their wealth to push prohibition while hiding their own drug trafficking history. They made certain nobody would connect the dots. Third, we question the institutions built with that money. Yale, Harvard, Columbia, museums, hospitals, foundations. All of them funded, at least partially, by opium money. Should they acknowledge that openly? Should there be reparations to China? Should the families that still benefit from this blood money be held accountable in some way? These are uncomfortable questions, but they absolutely need to be asked. Because right now, these families are still powerful. The Delanos, the Forbes, the Russells, the Cabots, they're still part of America's elite. They still hold wealth and influence that came directly from Chinese opium money, and they've never had to answer for any of it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's family made their fortune selling drugs to China. The Astors built their empire on opium. Forbes magazine exists because of opium profits. Skull and Bones was funded by opium money. Harvard, Yale, and Columbia have buildings paid for with opium profits. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The evidence exists in archives, letters, shipping records, account books. Researchers have proven it beyond any doubt. Books have been written by serious historians. But the average American doesn't know any of this because the story has been buried, whitewashed, erased from the official narrative. And the families that benefited don't want you to know. Because if you knew the truth, you'd realize that some of the most powerful, most respected, most influential families in American history are descended from drug traffickers. And the institutions they built, the universities, the foundations, the political dynasties, were all funded by poisoning millions of Chinese people. The truth is ugly, but it's still the truth. And it's time people knew. If this changed how you see American history, subscribe to this channel because there are more stories exactly like this one, more truths that have been buried, more lies that need to be exposed. The opium families got away with it for 200 years, but the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. It always finds a way to the surface, and I'll keep digging it up, one story at a time, until the full picture of where American power actually came from is impossible to ignore. These families built their empires on the backs of millions of destroyed lives. They rewrote history to protect their reputations. They made certain their descendants would never have to face what they did. But you know now. And knowledge like this doesn't stay contained. Share this. Talk about it. Make sure this history doesn't get buried again. Because the only way these families maintained their power for 2 centuries was through silence. And that silence just ended.